Good afternoon. So this is the Select Committee on the Armed Forces Bill. This is our first evidence session. We have four panels of people giving evidence to us this afternoon. This is our first panel. So welcome and thank you very much for taking the time to come and give evidence to us. And I'm going to leave it to you three now to introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, I'm Mark Atkinson. I'm the Director General of the Royal British Legion.
Good afternoon everybody, my name is Nick Pope and I chair Cobseo, which is the Confederation of Service Charities.
Good afternoon, my name is Ted Arnold. I'm Senior Public Affairs Policy Manager at Help for Heroes.
Okay, we'll just have the first question. Rachel.
Thank you very much. And before we start, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you and your organisations for all the fantastic work that you do for, certainly for veterans in my constituency of North Warwickshire and Bedworth and across the country. But the first question I've got is around the Armed Forces Covenant. What do you think are the shortcomings of the Covenant as things stand? And to what extent do you think this bill would address some or all of those shortcomings? I don't mind who wants to take that one first.
You start.
Yeah, thank you for the question and thanks for your comments about our organisations. If I can, maybe just a little bit of history from the Royal British Legion. I mean, we campaigned for the introduction of the Covenant. We led that campaign alongside other charities in the sector, and we're really pleased that back in 2011 the Covenant was first introduced. We spent the decade that followed that calling on successive governments to strengthen the Covenant, and we're really pleased back in the Armed Forces Act of 2021 that legal duty was first introduced. So there's been real progress over the last 15 years or so, and there is a real opportunity through the Armed Forces Bill that you're scrutinising to further strengthen that covenant. But there are undoubtedly gaps in what we currently have today, and which I hope will be addressed by the bill. So those gaps are both in terms of the policy areas that the duty applies to and the range of public bodies that it applies to. So we, both Nick and I, when giving evidence to the Defence Select Committee last year, really called on government to extend the breadth and the depth of the covenant duty to make sure that more within the armed forces community benefited from that protection. So I think, certainly wanting to see more areas covered, more public bodies covered, but also the awareness of the duty certainly needs attention. There's a lot to do, I think, to support the implementation of existing legislation, and if we're going to extend it, that's needed even further more so.
Ted.
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Mark's just said. I think the last act was really foundational. It moved the Covenant from being voluntary to a statutory duty, which I think really mattered for the veterans that we support. It raised awareness of the Covenant, but it also formalised consideration of service-related disadvantage. However, the scope was limited, I think, as Mark's just said, particularly in relation to national policymakers being under the framework, and also with regard to the policy areas that are under that scope. So I think this bill, or Clause 2, certainly addresses that structural gap. I think for the wounded, injured and sick veterans that we support, their recovery spans multiple systems. So not just healthcare, but having social care, welfare benefits and compensation, employment, I think really gives greater coherence across that recovery system. Which is critical to long-term independence of many of the veterans that we support.
Thank you. Is there anything you want to add, Nick?
If I could, because I just want to take us back to the idea behind the Covenant in the first place, which was to form a bond, really, between the nation and the military to talk about no disadvantage through service and special recognition for those young men and women who've given the most to this nation. That's a great thing to do, and it was a really, really laudable thing to do. So I think we would all agree that the Covenant for the last 14 or 15 years has given us a framework to get after that laudable aspiration. But the principles and the scope depend, I think, on four things. They depend on clear definition, they depend on effective application, they depend on robust enforcement, and they depend on clear measurement. We've got to get after all of those four aspects both with the current covenant and the future covenant, if we are going to really make a difference. So Mark and I and others in the sector, the Families Federations, the Help for Heroes, and others you'll hear from today, have consistently commented when we've looked at the annual report on the covenant each year about where we are falling short against areas like application. And I'll give you an example, let's say housing, where if you go across local authorities across the country, different local authorities might have a different view about how they see the covenant and how they train for the covenant, depending on whether or not there's somebody a councillor who's interested in the veterans community or the armed forces community, depending on whether there's an armed forces champion. So we've got a bit of a postcode lottery, arguably, that we may want to get after. So it's a complex and complicated area, but I think all of us collectively would say we really, really support the idea that's behind the extension of duty and behind what's in the bill.
Thank you. And do you think that the right policy areas are covered within the scope, or is there anything else you think needs to be included there?
So if I start off on scope, I think that the teams around the table here have done quite a lot of work with other government departments and with the devolved administrations to think about areas that we might think about in terms of policy. And in some areas we've taken an initial idea of 14 policy areas down to 12 by combining things like health and social care into a single policy area. It's quite actually an ambitious list, if I was to be honest. So getting under the skin of, if you're in an OGD, not the Ministry of Defence, what the covenant means to you and how it fits with your extant statutory guidance, I think is going to be a hard ask. So I would say start cautiously with 12. That's actually ambitious. And if necessary, move on. There will, however, be some areas where we would look to see where the current bill is up against the boundaries. So, for instance, if you go to some of our unitary authorities or councils like Manchester, or you go to some areas in some of the devolved administrations, I'm sure some of the work we do between now and the end of the year to tease out the statutory guidance that's associated with the bill will get into the detail of those particular areas.
Can I just briefly add? I mean, I guess the debate has been about breadth versus depth. Do you retain the existing policy areas but work harder to raise awareness amongst public bodies, amongst the armed forces community, and make sure that the covenant is having maximum effect? Or do you broaden and stretch it out? And government policy has been to go for that maximalist approach. That's one that we support at the Royal British Legion, that more policy areas should be covered. But to answer your question directly, there are areas where, even with this extended covenant duty, would not be covered. So if you take things such as domestic violence or financial well-being and debt, there are areas where we'd like to see further stretch. But to just build on Nick's comment, that has been the debate, breadth versus depth. And I think the principle of extending the covenant duty is the right one. But and I'm sure we'll talk about this in our session, what will come with that is an expectation around implementation and support for public bodies.
Can you give us an idea of how much resource the government has put into this as we stand now?
It's arguably a question that you might throw at the Ministry of Defence, because resource comes in 2 or 3 areas: time, manpower and money. I'm aware that previously, when I've been on the other side of the fence dealing with previous armed forces bills that have come in front of the House, the Ministry has had to provide a financial statement associated with the resource connotations. This one's more complex, I would argue, because you're looking now for resource implications across government rather than singularly from the MOD. So I'm afraid I can't answer the question, because I think it's really a question for statutory services.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thanks, Chair. As a veteran and a retired sapper, may I thank you for everything that you do and your organisations do for veterans up and down the country. And it's been huge improvements since I've retired on the support that veterans get, and I thank you for that. The bill would retain existing definitions of the covenant's legal duty with this due regard. And I know the principle of due regard was discussed at the previous committees as well. Do you not think that it should be replaced with a more prescriptive duty, or what would you define as due regard?
Yeah, I can go first. I think, you know, it's due regard is a recognised public law standard. We've seen it used with the Equality Act, so it really requires informed and documented consideration of service-related disadvantage. So, you know, it is procedural rather than outcome guaranteeing, but that I think is appropriate for this. It's, you know, the covenant is really about preventing disadvantage rather than creating necessarily automatic prioritisation, even though the principle of special consideration is there for those who've been injured or bereaved. So I think the key really is in the guidance, and that's making it clear that consideration should be evidenced, applied consistently as well. So that's the real important thing for us to get right now is the guidance following on from due regard.
I mean, Paul, I would support. By the way, my elder brother was a sapper, so I won't hold that against you. Yes, the word due regard, yes, the word disadvantage, yes, the word special recognition are now well understood. So if we move away from those particular words, then replacing would always be difficult. The trick, as Ted said, is in the statutory guidance, and I think that gives us the vehicle now, between now and the summer, to develop the guidance in a way which puts the teeth on the, puts the bones on the flesh on the bones of these kind of words, which arguably can mean different things to different people.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, it is an area, it's been mentioned, isn't it, the general awareness of the covenant, even across the public sector, isn't necessarily as good as it should be. And my worry, I'm a historical and previous local authority council leader, and we had an armed forces champion, we had an armed forces champion for a number of years. Other authorities didn't seem to think that to place any due regard on having a armed forces champion, for example. And I worry, where we're trying to legislate here now into law this covenant, that this, just to say, because the due regard of the Royal British Legion could be different to the due regard for South Whittle Borough Council, for example. You know, it is really challenging, especially across the public sector. And I think it's really important that we understand that, you know, the guidance is really, really robust, so that it is evidence, because what we could end up here with, and I'm interested in your comments, not careful, with a continued postcode lottery of the services of due regard up and down the country.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind starting. So I agree, and I think that the government's ambition here to broaden and deepen the duty is a positive one, and we should welcome it. However, the implementation, the consistency, the standards that Nick referred to are critical. We want to avoid that postcode lottery. So wherever you live, you know, as part of that armed forces community, there should be consistency. And what we do know is that there is low levels of awareness of the armed forces covenant duty within the armed forces, and the minister himself referred to, you know, the fact that, you know, many within the serving community don't know that this exists, that the protections are there. So we've got a job, I think, both a shared responsibility for government and charities like my own to raise awareness of the duty. We've got to make sure that public bodies are held accountable for its application. But what we also know is that there's a great deal of support amongst the general public for the Armed Forces Covenant. We did some polling back in 2025. Almost two-thirds of people, 73% of people really supported the Armed Forces Covenant duty. So we know that the general public believe in this. They see it as a way of recognising the service of those that have been within the Armed Forces. I think our job is to raise awareness and to hold public bodies to account.
If I could just supplement by saying that, so when we get into the statutory guidance development, and I'm delighted to say that government's been very good at leaning in towards the third sector to help develop the statutory guidance for which we feel included. And I guess the same principle is something that we would look to see playing across other government departments, because it's much easier to own a problem than it to be given to you. So as we develop the statutory guidance, I'd be hoping that we, in conjunction with the MOD, can lean out to OGDs to start to think about the guidance as it pertains to their own particular areas. If that happens, then the chances of us having effective application throughout the system is I think, more telling.
Christian, you've got a supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, you mentioned consistency of services. Obviously, in Greater Manchester, we have pockets of brilliance and then huge amounts of lacking. Obviously, Wigan being a prime example, and I speak as a Greater Manchester MP. What more can be done to actually share those elements of best practice? But also, when we refer to the Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey, only 22% in 2025 actually knew a lot about the Armed Forces Covenant, its implications and their rights. So what more can be done to actually feed that through not only to those former personnel, but also to the services that they are hoping to be using?
Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. So look, I think there is a shared responsibility. This is not just government and MOD. I think we, in the sector, the charity sector, also have responsibility to showcase and celebrate good practice of where the duty is being taken seriously by public bodies and help disseminate that good practice. But undoubtedly, through the statutory guidance and through other means, we do need to shine a light on what good looks like, as well as holding to account others that are not fulfilling their responsibilities. Could I just make one point, and this may be coming up in your questions, but we're conscious that the bill extends responsibilities both to local authorities, devolved administration, central government departments, etc. We think it would be beneficial for the bill, and certainly the statutory guidance, to be really clear that it also applies to combined authorities, to mayoral authorities, to the Greater London Authority. So being really clear, both on the face of the bill and to combined authorities in Manchester and elsewhere, that this applies to them and that they should also be held to account. So I'm not sure at the moment that reference to local authorities is specific enough that this does include combined mayoral authorities in the GLA.
If I could give a shout out, if I may, because you're going to get an answer, I think, on this particular question in a later panel when you speak to the families' federations, because arguably against the current provisions of the government, housing, education, employment, a lot of those issues pertain to the dependents, the partners and the spouses of those who are serving. And the kind of the consciousness and the families element of our business, I think, is an area where probably at the individual level, even though the word covenant may not be recognised, the individual aspects of the consequences of mobility, particularly across areas of the UK footprint, are those that will be most pertinently faced by wives, by partners, by children. So I guess I'd hold the question and ask it again in about half an hour's time.
Ian, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just coming back to the due regard element. At the moment, the guidance is that local authorities should show due regard. So I'm interested in, we keep in that same term, due regard, when we as a Defence Select Committee, in another role that I have here in the Commons, I heard we picked up concern about the wording of due regard from serving commanding officers who felt that it didn't give the impetus for those local authorities to actually demonstrate that they've actually shown due regard, because the metrics are so different across the board. Earlier, what Paul was saying is around it can be interpreted differently, and therefore would organisations like yourself like it to be more prescriptive in the role, so actually people then follow it?
Okay, if I may.
Nick.
I'll go back to an answer I gave about 10 minutes ago. My gut feeling is the term due regard is here to stay, but my gut feeling as well is if we get the statutory guidance right, then we will have a framework not only to seek to have effective application of the covenant across local authorities and other public bodies, but equally it gives us a framework to think about measurement, and then from measurement to holding to account. So I'm looking for the devil in the detail, basically. I'm looking for the detail and the guidance to enable us to get metrics together so that we can actually not just hold individual local authorities or other public bodies to account, but also to share best practice. And so I would shout out Manchester actually in local authority terms as an area which is demonstrating really good joined up coordinated governance in application of the covenant. And actually what I'd like to do is to find a vehicle for taking what's happening in Manchester and placing it in other areas of the country where arguably it's less well seen.
I'm going to move us on to the next question now, Pam.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for all the work that you do. One of the important aspects of this proposed revised covenant is that the duty will extend across Whitehall departments for the first time. How do you think the guidance issued by the Secretary of State on the legal duty should ensure consistent delivery of the Covenant across Whitehall departments, many of whom will be experiencing it for the first time?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I think it requires, that consideration at policy design stage, not just delivery. So having the clear statutory guidance, so practical examples is very important, and an element of training as well to help support those departments embed the Covenant principles into those considerations. So I think it would also be important to have support from the centre and central government and particularly the MOD in sort of helping ensure that consistent sort of implementation across Whitehall.
I would add that this is a cross-government type of activity we're looking for here, and we're in many respects using a single government department, the Ministry of Defence, to act as an advocate and a champion for cross-Whitehall activity. So I think it's for government in many respects to determine what governance framework it puts together to ensure you've got a vehicle to look at cross-government activity. So if I was not putting words in the Minister of the Armed Forces' mouth, but I'd be looking for a framework where you have a coordinating authority to push what, from a military perspective, seems a fantastic vehicle into other government departments who clearly have got a whole bundle of priorities of their own. So that cross-government framework, I think, is absolutely necessary when we're getting into robust application.
Thank you very much.
Can I briefly add, if that's okay? So I'm conscious, and this goes back to the earlier question about cost. I think there is a note in the explanatory note for the bill that states that the estimated cost for implementing the duty across government departments could lead to initial training and familiarisation costs of £307,000 to 1.5 million. I think our view at the Legion is that feels very low to take this covenant and to apply it across Whitehall departments. If that is the Ministry of Defence's estimate of the cost for Whitehall departments, it seems wholly inadequate. And look, I think there are bits of Whitehall for which this is going to be a significant piece of change. So if you take, for example, the Department for Work and Pensions, one of the big concerns that we have had is the unfair treatment of military compensation in respect of the means testing of benefits. And an example of that would be that military compensation is not taken into account when means testing for universal credit, but it is taken into account when means testing for pension credit. There's a whole piece of work to do within the Department of Work and Pensions to prepare them for the responsibilities that this bill and duty will place on them. So the idea that £307,000 to 1.5 million is really going to shift the dial across Whitehall, I think we're yet to be persuaded of that.
Thank you. Take that back. Thank you.
Al, you want to come in?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for all your support and the work over the last couple of years moving this forward. I'd be really interested in your view about holding other government departments to account and whose responsibility that should be. And importantly, how, for example, the annual report on education and communication capability, not just at the government level, but also at the local government level. And perhaps if you could also allude to how valor may be able to support that in conjunction with your work would be really useful.
If I kick off, if I may, on this one. You're absolutely right to say that legislatively right now we have a requirement to place in front of the House, or the MOD does, a Covenant annual report. And we in the sector and the Veterans Commissioners and others also get the chance to contribute to that report. It strikes me that when this bill comes into law, we'll need to think carefully about what kind of framework we use to place evidence back in front of the House. And actually the very act of corralling that evidence and conjoining it across government departments is no small effort. So I think we will need to think carefully with your Covenant teams about how we effectively do that in the future. With regards to the valor question, and it's taken nearly half an hour to get the valor word on the table, which I think is interesting. Valor is a new kid on the block in many respects. So for those of you who don't know, the Ministry of Defence is putting a new framework out to really get after effective coordination of activities that are happening at the local level and having a brain centrally to gather evidence, to think about prioritisation of activity. And then below that central brain, a framework of regional officers who can link into local authorities, integrated care boards, and other public organisations to really corral and coordinate activity at the local level. That in itself is a new kind of vehicle, which I think gives us an opportunity to think about how we coordinate activities in a way which is very consistent with the Covenant. Inside the MOD, therefore, the relationship between the Covenant, which relates to the armed forces community, serving, have served, wives, families, partners, dependents, and the bereaved community. The relationship between the Covenant and the valor approach, which starts with veterans, but will hopefully in time spin out to other areas of the armed forces community. We'll need to work out the governance framework. So yes, it's absolutely, I think, part and parcel of the delivery downstream. But yes, we've got work to do, I think, to make sure that the two areas are joined together.
Just add very briefly, if I can, just to say, look, I think it's a shared responsibility, Minister. You know, I think the Ministry of Defence and its ministerial team, working with other government departments, have got that coordination and that accountability responsibility. But certainly if I speak on behalf of RBL, you know, this is an organisation that is about campaigning, and I think we will certainly, as this duty gets extended across departments, want to shine a light on those that are doing really well, taking it seriously, adapting their policy, thinking about the armed forces community, and also shining a light on those that are not. And so I think we're coming from slightly different perspectives in that, you know, our job, I think, is to share great practice, but also to hold our feet to the fire. But there's also a shared responsibility with you and other MOD ministers.
Briefly, you want to come in, Paul?
Yeah, thanks. It's just tying back something that Mark said before, Chair, that and it reconfirms my concern about due regard, because the figure of 350,000 to 1.5 million for coordinating a budget, for coordinating, enshrining this in law across all of Whitehall, to me appears that there's not much due regard going on here, and that worries me. And I think that proves the point that we're discussing here, because you know, it looks like the MOD budget more on pencils than they do on actually coordinating this very piece of legislation, you know, and that does concern me. So I support what you say, Mark. Thank you, Chair.
That was just a comment. You're not expecting.
Yeah, I was
confirming. You don't have to respond if you don't want to. Juliet, sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for coming and for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today. We really do appreciate it. So thinking about when the Covenant's been implemented, how do you think, and you've touched on it a little bit, the government departments and the public sector or delivery bodies could be held accountable for the way that they deliver the Covenant?
Do you want to start?
Having sat in government and being held to account by other members of government for delivery of services or programmes of change, it's great when it's going well, and when it's not going so well, it can be quite a robust conversation. I think government, as I go back to my governance framework question earlier, if we collectively feel that a government department, so I'm DWP, let's say we're not delivering through DWP on some of the issues, one mechanism to call that out will be in the Covenant annual report at the end of the year. Another might be through a process involving commissioners or ombudsmen, or actually across Whitehall governance framework. So we've got different mechanisms that we can use to shout out where we see areas of either poor practice or areas where arguably government departments aren't necessarily putting their weight through the principle and the scope of what we're aiming to achieve. I guess the question that follows from that is where there is a government department that is failing to deliver on the intent and the scope of the Covenant and extension of duty, what mechanisms you have for incentivising or changing behaviours. That, I guess, is again a question for government really to argue about how it changes the paradigm based on the evidence that we provide. So we're going to have to provide evidence to enable somebody then to take a view on what can be done to either share best practice or to come up with a different way of delivery.
Can I just...
Okay, certainly.
Just thinking about potentially it being poor practice, and some of that might be around the knowledge. What do you think can be done to promote awareness amongst employees of the opportunities of this covenant? What more can be done? How do we raise awareness? How do we boost knowledge?
So really we're after an awareness campaign here and a communications framework which enables us to celebrate success and also arguably to pick up on areas of shortness. That, I think, is a whole of society, a whole of government, a whole of the third sector, a whole of industry approach, where we've probably got some work to do on all of our sides as to how we take this forward. But this is, for me, this is a big change. So the extension of duty, putting on the covenant so far, is an area where we are at the foothills of understanding what's really going to happen across government departments. So I think it's given us a really, really good framework. And building on what the Minister says about the relationship with valor, I think we've got some very, very interesting building blocks now to think very, very much differently about service. I would also, if I may, want to place this in context, because the vast bulk of the armed forces community leave service and thrive in society. They make fantastic contributions beyond service. So when we think about the framework for recruitment in the future, retention in the future, strategic reserve, which the committee will come back to, I think, next week to talk about the strategic work in the future. So placing the context is really, really important to me. So yes, communications matter, but communications in context also matter.
Okay.
Yes.
I was saying to Mark,
You go.
say something.
If you want to have an answer to that.
Just a slightly broader point, which is, I guess if you look at this through the lens of the individual, the ability to seek redress is very limited. So if you don't believe a government department or a local authority has given due regard and has taken forward the covenant duty seriously, what are your options? Your options are to seek a judicial review, which most people don't have the means to do, or to rely on organisations such as ourselves and those sat behind us to make representations to government. So there isn't, at the moment, an opportunity through Ombudsman, through the Armed Forces Commissioners, or other bodies to kind of raise that systemic concern that may exist. So I do wonder whether or not there is a sort of strengthening there. Yes, about accountability for departments, but also to support individuals to seek redress by strengthening Ombudsman and the commissioners.
Thanks. I actually had a follow-on question from Juliet's on employers. Now, of course, we've talked a lot about government departments and local authorities, but service leavers, spouses and others, they have a lot of interactions with employers, and I'm pleased to see employment is a new area that's being included in the Armed Forces Bill this time around. There are some employers that are excellent at working with service leavers. There are some employers who are terrible. What sort of lessons should we take away from your experience of that? How should we be better at engaging with employers? Any lessons for us to take away?
Yeah, okay. So there's a time in everybody's service where you've got to think about life after service. And you know, Paul's been here as well, and Al's been here as well, where for some people it comes as an unexpected shock, particularly if they're leaving at a time not of their own choosing. So those who are medically discharged or compulsorily discharged because of drugs or administrative actions. And each of those individuals therefore has a transition journey or a path which is unique to them as an individual. So that's the individual part of it. From an employer's perspective, there are 3 or 4 or 5 different frameworks we have right now to think about employers. So the MOD has a thing called the Career Transition Programme. So a programme that everybody who's leaving service on their own accord, who's done the requisite amount of service, has a programme basically to align them in terms of thinking about employment beyond service. Very, very effective programme, delivers great outcomes. There is a relationship between the covenant and industry, both public sector and private sector and third sector, through the Employers Recognition Scheme, predominantly focused through the lens of the reserve soldier, but there are about 13,000 signatories to the Employers Recognition Scheme. That's an enormous amount across the nation. of which 1,000 are gold members, there are about 4,000 silver members, 4,000 bronze members, and 4,000 new to the scheme. Fantastic. I would argue that it's a scheme that as yet we haven't thought through how we use it to best effect. So that's the second part. We in the sector run a series of clusters which bring like-minded charities together to think through how we might think about health or education, or in this case employment. Arguably it's more of a niche area which is looking about specific veterans or spouses and their employment in society. So you've got a number of governance mechanisms there. But in a future model where we're thinking about a strategic reserve, and this might come up in conversation next week, we might think differently about these organisational frameworks to enable government to have a conversation not just with an individual who is leaving service, but if we're thinking about blurring the boundaries of zigzag careers, continuum of service, strategic reserve, then a conversation with employers. I was struck a couple of years ago when I was actually visiting Israel, not long after the 7th of October. And I visited a factory, I won't say which company it was, but it had 8,000 employers. On September the 7th, 8,000 employees turned up to work. 2 days later, 3,500 of the 8,000 were driving south in Merca for 3 tanks. And the company didn't demur and carried on working, just going to 24/7 working to deliver the outputs. I would be less sure that that framework existed in the UK right now. So I think, when we think about our relationship and our contract with employers in the future, have got work to do, so that when we think about individuals leaving service and going into gainful employment, or partners and spouses going into gainful employment, that we think through the prism about readiness as well.
Great. Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back again just on the covenant, because I think, Cynic, last year you did talk about the danger of expansion is that we lose focus. And I am worried about that with the postcode lottery, but how we imply it. And it does feel like a huge amount of weight is now being put on this statutory guidance. I kind of just want to explore a bit more, because if due regard can't be too prescriptive, then how prescriptive should the statutory guidance be? Because it feels like that will be in place of it.
You have a better memory than I do, clearly. So that's the challenge really over the next 4 or 5 months. So some of the team from the MOD in the seats behind me, and members of the sector and colleagues from across government will be sitting down to put, as I said, flesh on the bones of each of the 12 policy areas. That it's not unique, but it's rare for us to sit together as different organisations to co-create and to co-author guidance. So I do think I'm kind of glass half full on this. I think we've got a vehicle here to deliver some guidance. And of course, when we do guidance, if you're sitting there as DWP or as any other form of local government, only some of this guidance is going to pertain to you. So arguably, horses for courses, and we will therefore develop guidance which is pertinent to individuals. I wouldn't expect somebody who's the Armed Forces champion of an ICB to read 12 lots of statutory guidance. And so hopefully there's a vehicle there. I'm being optimistic. Let's see whether this actually pans out.
Very briefly then, Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Just one final question. In 3.5 years, what does good look like?
So by 3.5 years, we will have taken statutory guidance. We will have had a bill that's gone through Parliament. We will have applied that guidance down across all government departments in a way which is about effective application. We will have developed a robust measurement framework to assess what good looks like, either by using valor or by using what other frameworks that we have. And we will develop within government a robust framework for holding to account, sharing best practice across government. And then arguably beyond that, to have raised the awareness, both within public sector bodies, private sector, the third sector and the armed force community, so everybody understands the government. If I lean back to July last year, this House delivered, I think, the covenant for society. You could argue that this covenant extension of duty and the covenant society are absolutely part and parcel of the same product, which is about, big society, collectivism, community, what we're all trying to get after. So good to me is delivery on all those areas. So when we write our answer to the Covenant Annual Report in 2029, 2030, we say jobs are good and tick VG.
Excellent. That's a perfect place to finish. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and give us your evidence this afternoon. Can we get the next panel in as quickly as possible? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Probably be me. We all settled. Okay. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to come and give evidence to us this afternoon. This is our second panel. We've been using first names, so is that okay with everyone? Thank you very much. I'm going to leave it to you to introduce yourselves and then we'll get to the questions. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I'm Becky Lovell from the Naval Families Federation. I'm Head of Policy and Deputy Chief Executive.
Hi, Collette Musgrave. I'm from the Army Families Federation. I'm the Chief Exec.
Andrea Devlin. I'm the Director of the RAF Families Federation.
Okay, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you very much and thank you for being here. Forces families do face a lot of challenges. They have to move regularly. They often face periods when one member is not there or has left or has died, and there are lots of issues that they face that other families do not. Bearing in mind all the aspects of life, be it health, be it education, children, everything wrapping around them, how well do you think the Covenant actually supports those forces families at present?
Who wants to go first?
That'll be me then.
Collette.
It's fine. It's fine. I think as we gave evidence to the House of Commons Defence Committee the last time, and thank you very much, you clearly all read that very closely, the answer at the moment is it is a very mixed bag. There are some service providers, there are some areas of the country that are very focused on the Armed Forces Covenant. They have a high level of understanding. Almost everywhere has a high level of empathy, but there is perhaps not necessarily the level of understanding of the complexity of service life and the very diverse nature of service life as well. If your experience is perhaps with one service, you may think that everybody's experience is a little bit like being in the army, whereas we know that the experience of perhaps being in the Navy, the Royal Marines, or in the Air Force can be very different. And each individual family, service personnel and their family, has been on a different journey. They will have experienced, we're all individuals, they will have had an individual journey as well, which some elements of it will have been very positive for them, some elements may have been very difficult because of their family situation. And so I think there is certainly a challenge for service families in engaging with providers, engaging with government, and really receiving a consistent level of support and understanding of their particular circumstances.
Can I add on to that?
Okay.
In terms of the challenges, some of the areas that we spoke about in our last evidence and also in our written evidence were around the language that's used. So quite often we find that there is a focus within some areas on the veteran community, which we absolutely recognise have very important needs that we've talked about. But it's understanding, broadening that out to the armed forces community, so that will include families, service personnel, their children, the bereaved community and their partners as well. So that's one area that we think really needs a focus as we move forward with this.
I was thinking particularly actually about families, about things like support at school, being pupil premium, being encouraged to apply for it or send support. So you're not only looking across local authorities, you're looking across multi-academy trusts. Have you found that to be an area where there is a large discrepancy between the way forces families cope?
It is one of the greatest areas of challenge, education, and that consistency of educational allowances and funding, not just within local authorities, but across government as well. Through the devolved administrations, it does cause a huge amount of hardship for some of the families. They're often moving short notice, they're often moving not necessarily for their choice, and we're seeing an increasing number of families choosing to allow serving personnel to go unaccompanied rather than disrupt the family for all of the reasons that you've just outlined, and because of that inconsistency, so that it's much simpler for the family to stay in one place and the serving person to travel, which of course then starts to impact on retention and brings, it may solve one problem, but it brings other challenges for that family too.
Could I add in there as well about so in terms of the Navy and Royal Marines, the dispersed family? So you asked specifically about support within schools, and we do find examples of that really good practice across the board. However, there are families do come to us and say that there isn't the recognition in their school, and it may be that they're in an area where there is a lower military footprint, and that could be one of the reasons for it. Equally, we do have other examples where they take particular care and they understand their obligations and they make provisions, but that can make a real difference. So it might be that also, talking from our point of view, it's the Navy, there's not the visibility on the mobility, which is one of the areas that people may be aware of that causes some disadvantage. It's the length of separation, so when those are 6 months, 9 months or longer than that, the children aren't coming in and out of school, so it's maybe not so obvious. And also with the submariner community, that no contact as well, which adds in a completely different element.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for your service. I always say when one person serves, the whole family does. So thank you very much for everything and all the support you've given me over the last year and a half. I'd just like to ask, that the Covenant extends the due regard to a multitude of different policy areas. Do you think they are the right areas, and are there any other areas you'd like to see included as we move forward with the bill?
We certainly welcome the extension. It's something that we have long argued for, because the experience of serving personnel and their families, much of the tension comes between the fact that they are actually seeking as citizens first. Whilst they are in the UK, they are seeking to access statutory provision, whether that's from their local multi-academy trust, whether it's from a health service, whether it's from another government department, and the tension that comes with service life, and the lack of understanding necessarily of service life, and some of the conflict even inside other government departments and the Ministry of Defence itself in terms of conflict of policy and processes. So overall, we absolutely welcome this on behalf of families. We can see in it many of the areas that we've talked about before, and that we've talked about the importance of extending it to. I think we'll probably go back to the argument that you heard from the previous panel. There is always that balance between depth and breadth. And we've certainly expressed concerns in the past that there may be a risk by going and seeking to extend too far that you're not actually able to support effective implementation, and you may very well lose some of the good practice that is already out there. So in general terms, I think yes, it probably does cover most of the key areas that we are looking at, but there are certainly, and perhaps I'll leave it to my colleagues, but there are certainly some specific areas where we would like to see a little bit more focus and a little bit more clarity. I completely appreciate that statutory guidance has yet to be developed, but it would be extremely helpful for families to be able to be confident that all aspects of family life however it might be for them, could actually be covered by the covenant, if not now, certainly with the intention that it goes into the future. We've referenced before particularly the private sector, and I know you heard that from the previous panel before, particularly in respect of provision of financial services. This is something that families, service personnel and their families come to us on a fairly regular basis about. Access to mortgages, credit, mobile phones, whatever it might be. That sits in the private sector. That's something that has to be, that we would very much want that to be looked at in due course.
Okay.
Just you guys had a quick second.
Carry on.
This is a theme I have a feeling we're going to pick up throughout the whole evidence session is one on coordination, coherence, and particularly consistency of the implementation of the covenant across government departments, local authorities, and all the different bodies that we rely upon. What would you like to see to help us, just MOD, but other government departments, enforce and hold people to account more effectively for the delivery of that due regard?
I think it is, consistency is going to be key to making this work, and I think it goes to Colette's point that being consistent across all areas will be more effective than broadening it any further. And I think one of the areas where we see some positivity coming is MOD being subject to this change as well, where you perhaps will get more consistency for your serving personnel as well, and they'll start to understand what the covenant can do for them, which I think sometimes is they don't see themselves necessarily, the serving person, as part of that covenant side of the house. So I think that is one area. But I think it is about that consistency, but there is going to need to be some accountability. Where do families go when that disadvantage or it does happen and they don't see a way forward and they don't know where to go? And we mentioned earlier about the recognition, the defence recognition, and understanding those best practice and understanding how we can put that accountability into it for families, because I think otherwise it just becomes quite hollow. They don't know where to go. They don't know how to escalate the problems that they're facing. And I think that needs to follow through. There needs to be, they use the families federations, but I think it needs to be greater than us.
Christian.
Thank you, Chair. Andrew, you mentioned just then that feeling of not knowing where to go. Indeed, it was RAF families themselves who talked about intervention often coming when you've hit rock bottom, and indeed at crisis point. I imagine most MPs will probably see that in their casework as well. What more do you think this bill or indeed the covenant should be doing in terms of early prevention, identifying that signposting, which so often is just either lacking or not quite right?
I think it does go back to that consistency. We could cite local authorities where it's exceptionally good. They're working extremely hard with their serving community, not just their veteran community. So they're inclusive of that armed forces community, and I think that is really key going forward as well. It's very easy to forget the broad definition of the armed forces community. So that would certainly make a difference, making sure that definition is truly always used and fully understood. It is not veterans and then as an add on the others. So it's that broadening of the armed forces community, understanding that does include the serving personnel, but it is building on that best practice and having that consistency. And often we've seen where there's an armed forces champion, it's an under-resourced role or it's a part-time role, or where we see success is very personality driven, as opposed to a consistent framework that allows them to understand what they need to do.
Could I add in there as well? So one of the things that we hope that it will achieve is to strengthen the recognition of some of these experiences that we've talked about for the family, so around the mobility, the separation, and really develop that understanding, and thereby having improved visibility for the service families. And as my colleague Andrea was saying, having that person-centred approach from services, from organisations, companies, private companies, employers, so that they know who it is that they need to go to speak about if they have their experiences, and more importantly, that the people who they are communicating with have that understanding and know exactly how to support them, and also to recognise their strengths too.
Okay. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. In some of the evidence we've received, it's been highlighted the difficulties that families have when they're posted between nations, so from England to Scotland or to Northern Ireland. People being put to the back of the queue for send waiting lists. I think in your own evidence you gave an example of childcare costs going up by £12,000 for a family that moved to England and Scotland. Do you think the covenant changes that now make devolved administrations responsible for paying due diligence to the covenant will help with that? And what more does government need to do to ensure that we remove those barriers insofar as possible?
Who wants to go first there?
I can take that first. We
Rebecca.
think it, thank you. I think it's absolutely, we really welcome it. That's what we think. We already know, that there's excellent work going on in all of the devolved nations, and we as Families Federation work very closely with various organisations across those nations. We believe that there will need to be some joint UK-wide guidance with clear national frameworks as well, and that there will need to be that cross-governmental working together so that there's a shared understanding of what we're trying to implement. There's potentially shared training as well, so that one of the experiences of our families is that they have, as you've said in our evidence, they have a very different experience. We understand about having a local provision, and that's important for both within England but also across devolved nations. So we understand that context, but it's thinking about what the family's experience is as they move in and out.
Because there was a recent change where service families that were leaving the service would not be disadvantaged about moving into council houses, and so they wouldn't have to be subject to the same residency tests as anyone else. Do you think that's the sort of thing that should be rolled out for all services across the board? Is that something that would be helpful, or is that being considered?
From the perspective of a family, I think the evidence to us is very strongly that yes, more of that consistency would be extremely helpful. Something like local connection is, whilst still resource dependent because there are only a certain number of homes in an area, is relatively straightforward to negotiate. Having said that, that actually took an awfully long time to get through. Once you start linking it to things where the devolved nations have their absolute right to have different taxation, to have different levels of childcare support, to have different approach to how they use resources locally, that does become quite challenging. So whilst of course we would sit here and say, from the evidence of our families, that would be a fantastic thing to do, there is an element of getting to that point that could be a long way down the line, and in the meantime focusing around ensuring that families understand what is available in any particular location, but docking with the idea that those service providers in any particular location also understand where it's about removing disadvantage rather than providing advantage. And I think that's sometimes where the grit can come in the system, and we all have that collective responsibility to help communicate and to help people to understand what the art of the possible is as we move forward. But yes, in answer to your question, yes, in 3.5 years' time, that's what I would love to see.
Thank you.
Luke.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate we've got a deeper dive into housing, I think, next week, but I just wanted to touch on it. How confident are you that the Defence Housing Service will bring much needed improvements to military housing?
We really welcome the establishment of the Defence Housing Service. I think it's something that we have long campaigned for as Families Federations, that housing is treated as homes. It is not treated as infrastructure or resource to be used as a tap for defence to control its spending or otherwise, and that moving into the Defence Housing Service is absolutely the right direction in which to go. It remains relatively early days. I think it's a little bit like the Covenant. We will see what implementation looks like. It is very promising at the moment. The Defence Housing Service appears to be being set up in a way that addresses all of the issues that certainly we have raised directly from families in the past, concerns around governance, transparency, engagement, hearing the customer voice, and we as Families Federations will, I hope, have a role in that. I happened to be in a meeting the other day where they had a nice branding in the corner that had a little house with Families First there. And that is an absolute, if that's an indication of a change of culture and a change of mindset when it comes to defence housing, that can only be positive. So everything that we are seeing so far looks like it is heading in the right direction. Housing and homes, however, are a little bit wider than simply the Defence Housing Service, and I think certainly when it comes to the single living accommodation, we do remain.
Well, and I think it plays to that point. We cannot. The Defence Housing Services is a positive. We're very optimistic about what it's doing, and it's changing the concept of the family. So it's recognising the long-term relationship situation. It's not just you must be in a civil partnership or married. So the long-term relationship aspect, those people who only have their children so many days a year and have shared parental responsibilities, and it's definitely going towards that. But what I hope as it moves forward and as MOD become part of the Covenant as well is that it doesn't lose sight of that single living accommodation. And those we get a lot of evidence of single accommodation where it never does feel like your own home, and for some people it may be their only home. So it's that single cohort are still very, very important. Those people who live in a shared mess facility. So yes, it's going in the right direction. Yes, we're very positive. I hope it doesn't lose sight of that as MOD come into the Covenant with it as well and start focusing on their single cohort as well as the relationship cohort.
Thank you.
Any more questions for committee? Well, thank you for coming and giving evidence to us. Is there anything that our questions haven't covered that you'd like to get across in the last few minutes that we've got?
I think we'd probably like to leave with the fact that language is so important in this, and if we could leave with one message and nothing else, it is that language that must include, when you talk about the Armed Forces Covenant, the serving personnel and their families and the bereaved, and not to lose sight of that as a definition.
Can I just add onto that as well? I completely agree with Andrea, and I know Collette supports that too in terms of the language, that it's really important that families understand the Covenant themselves so that they are empowered, that when they go to these services and they're experiencing any challenges, that they're able to use that. They know exactly that it applies to them, how it applies, and what they can also do if they have any problems and they need redress.
We have heard a lot in the previous session about due regard. Due regard is a very nebulous concept to a family when they're seeking to get a SEND assessment, when they're seeking to get a school place for their child, when they're seeking to get continuity of healthcare. Due regard is quite a challenging thing to be having a conversation with a family in crisis point about that. And that's something that I think leans to both the language and the inclusivity. It is really going to be really important to not only support the awareness levels of service providers and other government departments as to what the Armed Forces Covenant and extension of its duty means, but to be doing that other half as well, and to be supporting serving personnel and their families in understanding that.
You want to come
if we had a moment, Chair.
We have a few moments.
Okay.
I've now got a forest of arms.
Many of our serving personnel and their families come from overseas, from outside the UK, and make a fantastic contribution. How do you think the Covenant, extended Covenant, will improve their experience of service life and veteran life and family life?
I am going to be optimistic about this. and say that it will offer, again, I'll go back to my point about much of the friction for serving personnel and their families actually comes through the application of wider policies and processes that sit within other government departments. Predominantly in this case, obviously, the Home Office, but also in respect to the DWP, also in respect to access to healthcare, access to education, access to employment. I am hopeful that by extension to other government departments that this will give us more levers across government to be able to advocate and support non-UK personnel and non-UK families. They are not necessarily in the same family unit sometimes, which adds to the complexity of it. Because at the moment there does seem to be a little bit of a concentration of this is a Home Office problem. It's a visa and immigration problem, or it's a problem for the MOD to sort out with the Home Office. It isn't if you're a family member and you find yourself on a maternity ward and you haven't actually got the right documentation and you're presented with a bill along with your baby. That is not a very good space to be in. And our levers to be able to do that at the moment are very largely reliant on us as Families Federations, with the support of some of the charities behind us, and going in with a very long screwdriver and explaining it to people. I am hopeful that by extension of the Covenant that we will have more mechanisms to be able to do that. But that does go back to the point around escalation, redress, and when it comes down to it and you've got two departments who are like that, who is going to adjudicate and say, I've referenced it before, but we do have an issue around, it's not non-UK, but we do have an issue around another issue where DWP and MOD have been talking for years. And we have no resolution, and in the meantime we still have disadvantaged families who are there. My concern is that we do not end up in that same situation for that particular cohort.
Right, Rachel, Ian and Juliet. So very briefly, Rachel.
You've given us some very clear examples of where problems might happen. What do you think we could do to better address those? And is there a sort of education programme, particularly with families, as opposed to the serving personnel themselves, that we need to be looking at, do you think?
Families are a really hard cohort to communicate with sometimes, unless, we all can recognise the family that sits on a base, and that's how we always used to communicate. Of course, the challenge we have now is there's much more dispersed families who may or may not choose to engage with the armed forces. There's that difference there. So they're the hard cohort to develop that understanding, and often they have no concept of what we can do to help them until, as Collette said earlier, they're in crisis. So there is an education piece for sure, and where we've seen good practice on that, it has been in some of the local authorities where they are producing literature that really does include service families. It explicitly mentions them. It's a specific, this is what we can do for you. So I think there's a lot of good practice out there. It's making that more consistent across the whole of the UK and building that education. And obviously one of the ways of doing that actually is through the service person, because you have to educate the service person to have any chance of educating the family. So I think it's a combined approach across all levels really of that messaging that needs to go out, and resourced as well, rather than it being, as I said earlier, something that somebody does in their, because they're interested, as opposed to necessarily because they're fully resourced to broaden their understanding of the armed forces community.
Yes, Rebecca.
Add into that point as well. So it's a slightly different angle of what you're asking. However, raise the point that sometimes it's about meeting families where they are. So I know there's been work underway, for example, with the Best Start Families hubs, and we say that as a potential opportunity whereby families may come into there. If you can't underestimate the value of somebody saying to them, "Are you from an armed forces family?" and actually understanding what that means. Not saying they need anything special, but perhaps different and understanding. That's another way that we can really improve the education in this respect.
Thank you.
Ian?
Thank you, Chair. And I'll keep banging on about this point, but thank you for the service that you do, by the way, and thank you for the last evidence session that you gave to the Defence Committee. But no one should be disadvantaged as a result of their service, and that's what we're all here for, basically. And I in my mailbag, I've got a big garrison in my 1100 personnel at Chivner, get to know some of the issues around send, particularly around this question. And my question is again, do you think due regard is strong enough? Because and if it is not, what would you like to see? Because obviously the previous panel was talking about it's in the guidance. Now guidance can be followed or guidance cannot be followed. And by mandating this due regard bit, for particularly around send, what are your views? Would you think we should be stronger? Would it cause you less work and less hassle when you're doing negotiations with local authorities?
Who'd I go?
I think if we look at it from the perspective of the serving person and their family, I can absolutely understand, and they feed back to us on a I would say fairly regular basis. What does due regard mean? I've been told there's been due regard, but it doesn't feel like it to me. So I absolutely understand the challenge. I absolutely understand the importance of statutory guidance, but on behalf of serving personnel and their families, you can't but say due regard does need some strengthening in terms of its, in very simple language, to be able to explain it, both to the service provider and to the service person and their family. And to really boil it down to some really quite simple but impactful statements about what it is and what it isn't. And I think we will all spend a lot of time working with our colleagues to make sure that the statutory guidance is absolutely appropriate, that it is strong, that it can be used, but we do have to be mindful in that it is likely to be used by people who are not in the front line of providing those services and are going to be the people who are most likely to be under a lot of pressure, a lot of resource pressure. They've got a lot of people coming through the door to them, trying to understand this particular community and its needs. It's tough. I absolutely completely understand. I used to work in a call centre in my youth. I know how challenging it is, actually, for a precursor of DWP, as it turns out. But it's strengthening the understanding of due regard, so that at that level of the frontline person who is engaging directly with the service person and their family is going to be absolutely essential.
Okay. Juliet.
Thank you, Chair. Thinking about the extensions, so social care, employment support, send childcare, for instance, what do you think has the most potential to deliver for serving personnel, their families and veterans?
Are you thinking about particular policy areas? Yeah. So there was a range of policy areas that we particularly suggested. So they would include immigration, housing, education, employment, childcare. I'll just take one example of employment. I know that was talked about by the previous panel. So employment, we've talked about it from both sides. So understanding, so families understanding what their employers might be able to, obligations might be under the covenant. Families say to us, particularly when they are moving overseas, for example, they have a lot of questions and it's very difficult to find information about that. It's very complex. So they might be talking about, can I take my job abroad? Can I remote work, for example? And at the moment, the level of kind of maybe understanding and support with families is not there in some cases. And similarly, thinking about UK, it may be that families may need for a temporary period of time, caveat that period might be quite extended. They might want to change their working pattern, for example, or have reduced hours. So we think that has a real potential to have a positive impact. We know that the spousal employment has a significant impact on the family well-being, which in turn supports retention. So it's really, we think that's a particular example of an area that has a real potential for positive change.
I'll be very brief, Chair. You mentioned earlier this ongoing issue with the MOD and the DWP that's affecting negatively families in the forces. What's within this bill that we're looking at today is going to resolve that issue?
Potentially, number one, the covenant now applies to DWP. So, number one, there is something more in order to potentially name and shame in the Armed Forces Covenant report or to raise elsewhere. But without a mechanism of redress and holding to account, it's a bit challenging to see how some of these longer term and quite baked in issues might be resolved.
So would you agree then, final point, Chair, that due regard isn't necessarily appropriate, therefore?
In this particular case, I have to say that both DWP and MOD both feel that they have given due regard.
Thank you.
Okay, well that does conclude our evidence session. So thank you very much for taking the time to give evidence to us this afternoon. We really appreciate you coming along. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have our next panel. Okay, all settled? Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming along to give evidence. This is our third panel of the afternoon. We have one further panel after this. So I'll leave it to you to introduce yourselves and then we'll get to questions. Who wants to go first?
Chloe Mackay, the Chief Executive of Combat Stress.
Caroline Cooke, Head of Policy at Forces and Mind Trust.
And Andy Cole, I'm the Chief Executive of Royal Star and Garter.
We've been using first names, is that okay? Thank you very much. So the first question is Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for the amazing work that you do for the Armed Forces community. It really is appreciated. I want to start by asking quite a general question. How would you describe the current effectiveness of the Covenant for people that your organisation works with?
Let's go first.
Do you want to start, Chloe?
You would start.
I'll start. I think that we have we deliver mental health treatment and support, so we're working very much under the healthcare provision of the Covenant. So we are working in an area where the Covenant has already come into being, and I think there has been a lot of progress. We see the Armed Forces Covenant affecting commissioning of services, and we see particularly successful accreditation schemes, so both with GPs and NHS trusts, and they are quite simple and there is good take-up of those in England. I think what we don't see is necessarily the parts of the system working together. So whilst each individual part of the system might have a scheme or an initiative, there isn't the join up for a person who is travelling through the pathway. And some of the connections, for example, somebody who has come into a service for their PTSD and through an assessment process understands that in fact they have a more serious psychiatric disorder, a transfer of that individual into secondary healthcare, NHS healthcare is very challenging. So I would just kind of open up by saying it's great to see the progress, and we really want to hold on to the progress, but there is much more to do even in the established area of healthcare.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. And Forces in Mind Trust is an endowed trust funded by the lottery for a period of 20 years with the aim of improving transition from military to civilian life for the serving personnel and their family, and that's across the UK. And so since 2011, the way we delivered our mission is to fund the generation of evidence, primarily research evidence, into what works, which means that since 2016, we have funded a series of research reports on the Covenant and its effectiveness in practice. Our last research report that was based on research over 2 years by Shared Intelligence, Rand UK and Mary Mayhew consultants, it reported, and the report was published in October, and we've been taking the findings of that out to local authorities. We've had a really, really good appetite and engagement with that, which I think already shows something very positive. But briefly, the things that it has shown are very encouraging, the evidence. And yes, there are things that don't work so well, but the evidence also shows that the Covenant has played a really key role in helping to legitimise the prioritisation of the armed forces community at a local level and at a national level. But in doing that, what it has prompted is provided a framework for a shared language. And we've seen that in the case studies that are in the research as well. That, for example, in Cardiff, it's the Health Board that chairs the Covenant Partnership Group. And just bringing that working together across different issues is something that the Covenant has enabled. It has also really helped improve the referrals process, and it's given an impetus to the funding of dedicated roles within local authorities, or where there aren't full-time roles, people have had it as part of their job, and where there's been buy-in at a leadership level and council leaders are the armed forces champion, then it's made a real difference throughout the authority. And so in a whole range of ways, the Covenant, and particularly the introduction of the legal duty of due regard previously, pushed it up the agenda. And so however much we debate the value of the term due regard, just having public authorities knowing that duty exists has already improved policy and practice. So I think I'd stop there.
It's helpful, thank you.
Okay.
Andy.
So Royal Star and Garter is a social care provider. We're one of the major providers of care homes and other social care services to the veteran community. So the very simple answer to your question is social care has been excluded from the Covenant up till now. So, but to open up the question slightly, and we are delighted to see it potentially on the list for expansion. It's already been mentioned, some of the accreditation schemes and programs that have run in health, our closest allied area, have been incredibly positive. They've driven on variation in practice, they've pushed areas of work around integration. And those are all very important areas that we would see naturally fall into social care as well. At the moment, there are artificial boundaries. If we are looking to move an individual from a GP to a hospital and then potentially to a social care service, there is a gap and a divide. And even the same commissioning body, a local authority or an ICB, may say and have said, we can only take it this far in terms of the veteran status. And to pick up on some of what Caroline was saying, we have wonderful examples where people have gone through that, where the teams, healthcare teams or council, armed forces networks have picked up the individual, ignored the artificial boundary and said, of course, we've just had a gentleman move into one of our homes who was in a hospital in Milton Keynes, had been bouncing in and out of that hospital for several years, and it took an individual, really inspired individual, to join the dots up and give us a call to say, can you help? To which, of course, the answer was yes. But there was no natural pathway. So we are very hopeful that this change will put that pathway formally in place.
Thank you. Chair.
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask a bit more about, and we've discussed it before, about how well the Covenant is understood amongst the forces community. Do you think it's a sort of equal application of everyone not sort of understanding, or do you think there are pockets that do understand it a little bit better and not? And in which case, which ones are those, do you think?
I would base some of my answer on our recently published research on transition and how it's working in practice by Kinetic. And it's clear that there isn't as much awareness, knowledge and understanding at an early stage in service as we would like there to be, and that there is more work to be done there.
Yeah, I was thinking there's a national transition event that they know that Mission can support, and that's next Monday, actually, 2nd of March at Silverstone, which is in my constituency, which I'll be at. And I know there's a big focus on trying to help, and I know, Al, you were there last year. But so that's where I feel that there's greater knowledge, but as you said, it feels like early stage, perhaps not. So, yeah.
I'd also add that when it comes to families' awareness and understanding of the covenant and no disadvantage, and the effect that has on transition, then it is difficult, and as colleagues from the federations were saying, getting that engagement is difficult. And so at the moment we're working with an organisation called Thinks Insight, and we're funding a project on behavioural insight, sort of change on different ways of communicating and engaging family members in understanding transition in as holistic a way as possible, which means also understanding the covenant too. And I think a lot does come down to communication, rather than it all being dependent on the individual to go and find out. But also, I think it's part of the wider life skills piece, and the level of sort of education, awareness and understanding that happens when you're joining as well as throughout service and when you're leaving.
Ian.
Yeah. Thanks. Andy, expanding on what you said around the social care aspect of it, what real challenges do the armed forces community face in accessing social care? And what do you think the Covenant new perspective on that, how that will help the situation?
So there's a couple of elements of that. The key one is good social care is person-centred. It understands the individual it is trying to support. Social care is rarely trying to fix a clinical issue we might well have, as we do high-quality nursing care where we're looking after long-term conditions. But if you do not understand the individual, you cannot provide good quality social care. We see this particularly in dementia, which is focusing on older age, generally older age residents. For good quality care plans to be put together, you need to understand that individual has served, the type of service they might have had. We have people in our homes who've done the whole journey. We've had people who've done national service and were very pleased to leave. Somewhere in there is that spectrum, and we have to be able to tailor that care. You can't deliver particularly high quality dementia care without knowing that. We had a wonderful example the other day that there was an individual living with dementia in one of the homes that we've recently accredited through our veteran friendly framework, who the local staff couldn't understand why he had to carry cutlery with him all the time. He was a Navy veteran. He was living in a moment where he thought he was about to be deployed, and he would get very agitated if the cutlery was taken away from him. That has adapted that care plan. You would not know that was the case unless particularly you'd been asked on admission to the care home, did you serve, did your loved one serve? There is a very basic side of this, which is just if we don't know, if we don't ask and we don't know, we can't adapt the care that we provide. The other is about advantage, so making sure that the wider range of services, you heard from RBL earlier, how does a local RBL group wrap around its care home to make sure it's supporting its veterans? How do the health services, with so many excellent opportunities to engage, know that they have someone to engage with? It shouldn't be, as we hear sadly all too often, if only I'd known that my veteran father or mother or brother or daughter could have been involved in this, then it would have been better for them, and regret that comes from that. So a lot of this is also additive.
I think I read somewhere that 46% of your clients have got dementia.
Ours, yes.
Yeah, and accessing that dementia care from social services will most probably contact you to say, have you got a position, have you got a void that someone can take? Do they have a mandatory question on their assessment forms that ask them if they've ever served?
Generally, no.
So I'm just thinking that would. As an ex-housing officer, I would have, that's.
I was briefing a local council armed forces network a couple of weeks ago, and the answer was no to that council, and I think quite possibly London-wide because it was a London borough.
Mm. Chloe, Caroline, anything else to add on the social care aspect?
So our linkages through to social care would benefit hugely from having identified veterans champions, so that there is somebody who is there to link into. So when we're making referrals of a case or linking into a social work team for communication and updates, it is quite hard to follow who is in the system and to speak to somebody who consistently understands the Armed Forces background and the Armed Forces case. And I think that has been, the Armed Forces champion model has been successfully rolled out in other areas. If that could be rolled out within the social work environment, that would be hugely beneficial.
Mm.
And I would just add that when it comes to thinking about likely impact of extending the scope to social care, something that we don't know when it comes to data and information is those personnel who are still serving, who may have family members who are users of social care, are not mapped or we don't know the levels at all. We do have awareness and knowledge when it comes to older veterans, but it's a different cohort to think about too.
Absolutely. I would just echo that. It's really important to remember social care is for all ages, including children. Our work is primarily on older age veterans, but our youngest veteran's in his 30s. He's an Iraq vet. But yes, over 50% of veterans are over 65 anyway. A third have some type of disability. There is a cohort there who will need some degree of even light social care support at some point in the near future.
And could I ask the same question regarding the armed forces community in some of the challenges they face around employment that you may have come across?
I think I'll start by saying that using the evidence that Forces in Mind Trust has funded, that particularly when it comes to families and extending the scope to employment, we know at the moment that frequent relocations mean that it's difficult to maintain a consistent employment record, and that lack of employer understanding of that is an issue for families' careers. It would be brilliant if, as a consequence of the covenant, when it comes to employers' sort of screening of CVs, there is some awareness and understanding of the unique impact of service. That means people aren't screened out immediately because they happen to be part of a service family. When it comes to other elements of employment, then underemployment of certain groups of people who've served, including female veterans, people from ethnic minorities, disabled and older veterans. There is evidence, again through the research I mentioned earlier, on transition and experience of that at the moment, that people are transitioning into employment but not at a level that really uses their skills as much as possible. And so knowing that already what the covenant due regard did when it was introduced, for the 3 areas it was introduced in, was to increase awareness, understanding of the unique impact, then I sort of want to be optimistic about employment as well and the potential lever that a covenant extension could be.
Could I just give you a golden moment now? And is there any other policy areas that you think the Select Committee should be aware of that could be improved, or you'd like to see in there?
The Forces in Mind Trust position is that we're really happy with the breadth of the extension, and rather than thinking only about
the specific issues, because I think it is quite comprehensive. I know RBL talked about some additional areas. I think it is reasonably comprehensive, and we're content with that. I think one of the golden opportunities is the extension to central government departments and to the devolved assemblies, and the way that it is adopted, communicated, and, dare I say, resourced as well, will be key. And I think that the capacity of MOD at a time when they are under pressure to be able to do the communicating and engagement, along with all of us, everyone working in the sector has got that sort of desire to do all we can across all of those areas. And I don't want to be pessimistic about that either, because there is already so much good work going on in a lot of different government departments. My colleague Isabel behind me and I have a meeting with Ministry of Justice on Thursday, and we know that the work in the whole justice system actually has been very positive, and there is a lot of goodwill and a lot of hard work on identifying veterans in the criminal justice system that's happened even before we have the duty extended to central government, and could give lots of other examples that apply to other departments.
If I may, I think I agree with Caroline. I think that the breadth is positive to see. We were obviously very pleased to see social care move to come in, even as health and social care. If that mirrors the name of the department, then so be it. But social care is commissioned, operated, run in a different way, and it is not the NHS, and there is something that we need to make. It's a very disparate, less top-down, very multifaceted sector. It's got a 1.5+ million staff in its own right as a sector, but most of those are 20 people operating a small service. So it's a very different beast that we are dealing with. I think the key, which I think is really important, is the broader breadth of the organisations this is going to cover. So getting into all the different council structures, the regional structures, the mayoral structures, because the commissioning for us of health and social care is so slightly varied between all of those. To see any gaps would be problematic, because we could end up with a really unintended variation where somehow it was in a council's remit but not in a county council's remit. So those would be important to see. And we do talk to councils quite a lot. And I think they sometimes struggle to see why there's an artificial boundary when they are signatories to the covenant, but only half of the services they provide are covered by their duties. I hope there's just a clarity there that will, as we've been talking about all afternoon, sort of show that sort of joined up working.
And I think we welcome the extension in order to enable the connectivity across different government departments. We'd also like to see health continuing to develop rather than the existing areas sort of become static and kind of stop where they are. So the journey has started in health but needs to continue. And I think one of the points that has been picked up earlier is that that rollout, that join up, can be driven by increased awareness of the armed forces community that the covenant exists, because if people are asking for the services, then that's going to stimulate them to change and grow. And I think that's probably that demand ask from the armed forces community probably isn't happening now. So all of the work and effort is within the services and spreading the communication within the people delivering the services rather than the people who are accessing the services.
Thank you. Hey, Christian.
Thank you, Chair. Also, the Secretary of State, as part of the legislation, will have the power to issue guidance, which is an incredibly powerful tool when you think it's cross-departmental, cross layers of government, cross-society. In the last panel, part of the concern was how is the covenant going to be applied consistently? So with that guidance in mind, what would you want it to say to make sure that consistency is key in this element? To anyone.
I'll go.
Caroline.
I think it's a really fine balance between being prescriptive because we want things to be consistent and having guidance that promotes good practice but is flexible enough to adapt to the local environment. And I would refer again, to our latest research, because what it did was specifically look at the different contexts that the covenant is delivered in, and the guidance will need to take account of those. So the case studies included Greater Manchester as a combined authority, but it then looked at unitary authorities of Glasgow, Cardiff and Lovell, Morgan and East Riding, and the different characteristics of covenant delivery in unitary authorities, as well as looking at Oxfordshire as a two-tier authority. And I think even as I say that, it begins to unpack the complexity of having guidance that promotes consistency, but does place the onus on those who are delivering the covenant for thinking about what the guidance means to their own context. And so I think there's no getting away from needing to have guidance that enables those that are delivering, and so local councillors, if you're looking at local authority, really thinking through what no disadvantage means in their particular area as well.
Chloe.
I would add that the kind of consistent use of terminology will be really useful. So I think there's a really strong use of the term Armed Forces Champions. I think that's used across lots of different organisations. So promotion of that consistent language would be helpful. When it comes to the accreditation schemes, there's different terms that are used. So veteran friendly, veteran aware, and there's some other terms as well. So some sort of promotion of a consistent set of words would help the people accessing the services to understand what is being achieved and that it should be the same across the different services in different locations.
And I agree, all of the above. And the other area I'd really love to see focused on is about third-party delivery. So there should be a duty, if you are commissioning services through a third party, to make sure that that service is then given due regard. I think we gave in our written evidence earlier this year examples of something like funded nursing care, for example, which is NHS money which ends up in social care funding, but there is nothing in the contract, as far as we can see, that says there should be any sense of due regard given to that, even though you are clearly commissioning you're commissioning nursing care in a care home or other situation. So, and there are multiple examples of that where, whether it's private or not-for-profit organisations who are being commissioned, let's be consistent about what we mean and making sure that they own the covenant as well as the commissioner.
Thank you. Andy, I'd like to push on a comment you made in response to a early question, but actually apply it to you, Chloe. And it was, don't ask, don't know. So obviously we see that in quite a few areas, but I like to think in regards to your work with Opnova as to how that could be applied more vigorously and how that could be applied in some of the guidance coming forward, so that we're always asking first, have you served? Or are you an Armed Forces family? You know, do you have some sort of link? Because for the work that you've done, obviously 60% went on to mental health services, that they were probably in crisis point already. So what can we be doing to bring that intervention level even earlier?
And I think asking the question across all of these services, asking the question, have you served, is very, very powerful, because and people that do that well can now ask it very well. So I think the universal credit system has the question embedded in it, have you served, and it's asked in a very neutral way around your employment experience, and I think that will encourage people to answer it. And as that becomes the norm through services, I think the Armed Forces veterans will be more willing to answer it because they understand why it is being asked, and they understand that it's being asked in order to tailor the services to their need, not to put it into some other database that might exist. So the have you served question is very powerful and a really important factor across all services.
To feed into that response, obviously I think it was 22% of personnel were responding that we knew quite a lot about the covenant. What more can we be doing, either as parliamentarians, as a department, through all civil society, to make sure that people understand that if they are being asked that question, there's a particular reason for it, and it is actually trying to be helpful.
I think that's really important. I think awareness of what public services are trying to achieve and why the questions are being asked, and more that can be done through awareness schemes, advertising schemes, information provided to serving veterans, serving personnel, because then you know what's going to happen when you leave. I think the more that can be done around that, then actually the more take-up there will be, which will drive the success of the Covenant.
And if I might, I think once we have got the answer to that question, making sure it's singularly recorded. So the long move to single health and social care records, which we're very supportive of, if you've caught that information at GP level, we don't need to ask again. We know it should be coming through to us, and then we really can be on the ball about this. So getting some shared data records in is an important step.
That might be a separate conversation for a separate day on that one.
Okay, that concludes our questions. So thank you very much for coming along and assisting us in our inquiry this afternoon. The next session, the next witnesses are giving evidence virtually. So there's going to be a little hiatus while we check the connections and things. So I'm going to use that as a comfort break. And I'll Okay, welcome back, everybody. We've had a slight hiccup with communications. One of our witnesses is we're trying to connect with, but those two of you who can hear me, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to give evidence to us this afternoon. I will leave it to the two of you to introduce yourselves. So I'll go to Susie Hamilton first. Oh, right.
Oh no.
We have another communication problem.
Oh, goodness me.
I'm just gone.
Oh, she's on mute.
Is she?
Unmute herself.
I think she just did it. Are you on mute? This is the classic question.
Are we on mute?
We might be on mute.
He's trying to join on his phone because he thinks it's the...
We have to unmute her.
No, we're on mute, I think is what she's saying.
Right, that's it. It was the host blocking me from unmuting. So thank you for unblocking me. Good afternoon. I'm Susie Hamilton, Scottish Veterans Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Did you hear me earlier on thanking you for coming to give evidence? And just started to lose the will to live here. David Johnson, can you hear me?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. David Johnson. I'm the Veterans Commissioner for Northern Ireland.
And just check in that James Phillips can't hear me yet? No. Okay, right. Well, we're going to crack on with questions. Thank you again for taking the time to give evidence to us. I'll start with Gerald.
Thanks, Chair, and welcome both. I think it's fair to say that there is sort of patchy coverage with the Covenant per se, and in terms of awareness and various aspects. But could you talk about your thoughts on the extension of the Covenant and how that can improve outcomes for veterans? Particularly keen to hear the Welsh dimension, and see James Phillips back in the room, so that's great. But obviously equally so across England and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well.
Just hold your thoughts just for a minute. I just want to check. James, can you hear us? James, are you hearing? Are we coming through? Right, I think...
Muted again, I think.
Put your thumbs up.
Okay, can you hear us? Would you put your thumb up if you can hear us? Yeah, okay, but we can't hear you, so we'll try and correct that. So who wants to start, Susie or David, whilst if we start...
You're also muted as well, though, because the microphone's not popping up.
David, do you want to take this?
It's our system that's shut down again.
Oh.
Keep muting.
Microphones are on any one of their views.
Right. Okay. Susie, can you communicate with us?
No.
Who's doing the IT? Who's doing the IT? Because it's the microphones you've lost on the screen. Someone just needs to put the microphones back on. I think it's your man, isn't it?
Host has blocked them, basically.
There you go.
Okay,
Excellent.
we've been unmuted.
No, what's
Thank you.
going on here? But carry on. While we've got you, go for it.
Right, okay, thank you very much. So in principle, I think any extension to greater policy areas is a good idea and will benefit the veteran community. I think in some of these policy areas, I think we're going to have more impact and more value than others. I'm particularly pleased to see the extension to benefits and welfare and also to the justice system. And I think it's important as well extending it to the devolved governments themselves, and that will lead to more to better overall control and hopefully better collaboration. I think in areas such as transport, I'm not sure how much impact there will be, and personal taxation was one that potentially is going to introduce more complexity than anything else, and perhaps is more serving population. But overall, and as has been said, I think by just about every participant this afternoon, the key is about implementation. So regardless of the number of the breadth of the policy areas, the key is going to be about the quality of the implementation and of the monitoring of the implementation and the practice.
Okay. David, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, indeed. So like the other participants, certainly in Northern Ireland here, we welcome the extension. I think it's extremely positive. I think the government deserves credit for bringing this legislation forward. And yes, the addition of new areas to add to perhaps the core areas that have always fallen under the covenant or have been focused on under the covenant. I think the extension, again, is very positive. It's great to move into a wider breadth of area. I suppose, as already mentioned by Susie, the challenge is delivery. And I suppose it's better to deliver very well on key areas than perhaps not deliver well on a whole range of areas. So I suppose it's getting that balance, but overall very welcome. And the wider that we can extend, the covenant, the wider that the duty extends, I think it lets veterans feel that the promise, the pledge of the covenant is being delivered. So I'm all for extending it as far as possible, as long as we don't hype it to a point and then create frustration. So the expectation levels of delivery, I think, are important.
Okay, and James?
We've muted him again.
Right.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Right, yes, brilliant. Yeah. Nice to join you. Yeah, no, I reiterate what the other commissioners have said. I mean, it's very welcome to broaden the remit, and I congratulate the government as well in pushing to achieve that. I think in many areas, as Susie said, assist in terms of preventing inadvertent disadvantage through people being more aware of the sacrifice and problems of service and what those impacts can have in terms of the armed forces community, but particularly after service for veterans. But I think, as we've seen from those key areas already, which have been subject to due regard, health, education, so housing, the awareness is great. Goodwill is nearly always there, particularly in Wales in terms of implementation. But without the resources or the system and services themselves working well, such as health and housing, having adequate supply, then the covenant can have an impact.
Gerald.
Could you perhaps talk about the particular challenges that veterans face in each of the devolved nations, specific to obviously each of the nations individually?
Who'd like to go first? Shall I select one of you because you're not in the room with one another? David, would you like to go first?
Yeah, that's a great choice, Chair. I can keep you for about an hour and a half on this one. But yeah, within Northern Ireland, we obviously, as everyone will know, have some what I call unique challenges. I think sometimes the challenges are overplayed. I think as we've moved on from the conflict, we're now almost 30 years. I think all too often, when it comes to matters of the Covenant and Northern Ireland, there has been for too long and too often an easy option, perhaps for Westminster, just to say, well, that's Northern Ireland, that's different, that's a poison chalice, we're not going to touch that. Thankfully, that mindset is changing, and I'm glad to be positive with the committee today to say that, and certainly in the last 12 months, and I've come into this post and understood the challenges, we've made some real significant progress. So it's different in that the devolved assembly in Northern Ireland isn't the same as Wales and Scotland. It has the extra layer of complication because of the Troubles. But just in November, Chair, through the Chair to the questioner, the Stormont Assembly voted to adopt the Armed Forces Covenant. And with that, departments are now instructed to have an Armed Forces liaison officer. And that has led to real tangible delivery to veterans in some of the key areas of health, housing, education. So the challenges are there, they're obvious, but we are seeking to get over those hurdles. They're not insurmountable. And we want to move towards normalisation. We want veterans in Northern Ireland to feel that they are equal with veterans throughout the rest of GB. And I think we are moving in a positive direction on that.
James, do you have?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the challenges in Wales are shared challenges with the wider population. It's social and economic challenges, cost of living, and as I spoke about earlier, particularly in the areas of health and housing, where supply of affordable housing is difficult, and a health service which is facing long waiting lists, particularly for those issues which affect the veteran population, which is particularly musculoskeletal, orthopedic, and mental health. I mean, mental health does have its own pathway, but particularly in the orthopedic side, we're seeing sort of waiting lists of up to 2 years for knee replacements and hip replacements, and that musculoskeletal degradation is something which a lot of veterans suffer. And so you have veterans who are relatively young, sort of 50s, in their 50s, who really need joints replacing, but not able to contribute to society economically, or are suffering mental and physical health because of the injuries that they've sustained through service, but cannot get rectified through the National Health Service in Wales without waiting for 18 months or 2 years for that surgery.
Susie, can you unmute yourself? Well, I'm told that the...
Okay, thank you. I don't know, it keeps stopping me from unmuting. Apologies. Yes.
There's a glitch in the system, clearly. But carry on.
Again. Yeah, gone again.
That little icon is there.
Can you unmute?
No. Came back. Almost.
Right. I'm not reading into anything about keep getting muted there. I think it's just, with the devolved nations, because services are different, because things are set up differently, and I do hear from veterans quite frequently that what they see happening in one part of the country is not accessible to veterans in Scotland. So I don't think the needs are necessarily particularly different. Perhaps we have slightly different geography, so we have a bit more remote and rural, veterans in remote and rural areas, which does cause its own challenges. But because we see this inconsistency of what might be provided, for example, in NHS England, there's justice support for veterans provided by NHS England, and there's no equivalent to that in Scotland. And there's lots of areas where there's an equivalency. So that's confusing and difficult for veterans, because they have all served in the armed forces and all expect to get the same level. And sometimes it's to their advantage what is provided in Scotland, and sometimes they may see it as a disadvantage. So, but it's very confusing because there are different services. So, anything that can be done to level out those inconsistencies will definitely be very helpful. And I think that's where expanding the covenant duty to these other areas can only be helpful, because that means that service providers, policymakers will at least have to look at what is being provided and seeing if there is any disadvantage being inferred.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question from me now. I'm Pam Cox, member of the committee. You've half answered it, but we've been talking about consistencies and inconsistencies. I wonder, do you three meet regularly? Do you swap tales of consistencies and inconsistencies, and are they logged somewhere in a handy table that we might look at?
We do. Sorry, Will. We do meet. We were due to meet this afternoon, actually, but we postponed it because we would rather listen to this committee earlier. So I don't think we compile a log. We don't hold that data as commissioners, to my knowledge, no. But I think as individuals, we probably, as individual commissioners, have a good understanding of where these inconsistencies occur.
I think it would be really helpful, certainly to me as a committee member, if we had a better understanding of what those inconsistencies are between the groups you're representing. But I guess, and the bigger question is, how do you think that the Covenant will work to eliminate inconsistencies or eradicate where, as far as possible? Don't mind.
Susie, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I mean it has a limited. It will have a limited effect. It's about it's about process and policy. It's not about outcomes. And I certainly, when I'm looking at veterans issues, I'm usually looking at outcomes. And there are some of the inconsistencies are because, for example, England has a probation service, whereas in Scotland has 32 different justice social work services. So there are structural differences that go far deeper than just veterans issues. But I think the fact that there will be a requirement to at least consider the impact on the armed forces and veteran community in policy should at least start consideration. But certainly, I don't think it's going to mean that there will be a definite change in outcomes.
James.
Yeah, thank you. I think difference is inherent in devolution, and that's what people voted for. So it's difficult when most of the services that actually impact on veterans' lives are, the key ones that are devolved anyway. So without a UK-wide veteran service, a lot of veterans will say, "Oh, why can't we have it like the US with a veterans organisation which provides healthcare as well as other services across the UK?" Then it will look different and it will feel different. And really, you have to judge whether a veteran is being disadvantaged against a non-veteran peer when it comes to housing or health that lives in Wales. It's very difficult to make that comparison with a veteran living in England about how quickly they get a knee replacement or they get other outcomes which are in a devolved setting. So I think it's, we have valor coming in, and that's welcome, and that will be UK wide. But again, that service will have nuances depending on which devolved setting the service sits in. And I'm not sure there's an easy solution to that, or whether devolved administrations would want an easy solution.
David.
Yes, I think the key is, it's already been alluded to, is that there is a huge disparity and diversity across the different regions of the UK, but also within each region, depending on location, and that in itself makes it very difficult to get consistency into delivery. For me, I think the key going forward is very much around education and communication. So education in terms of educating the local governments, in our case, the local councils, exactly what the covenant duty is and their responsibility to it. There's also a need to educate the armed forces community and veterans so that their expectation is not too high. And I still bump into veterans who have this mindset that the covenant means that they're bumped up waiting lists, for instance, or will get a house quicker than somebody else. And of course, that's not what it is. It's about not having disadvantage. So I think that education piece will help bring the consistency and would help bring the value of this extension. And then on top of all of that is simply communication. I think one of the real benefits of this bill is putting this topic in the public discussion. It's in the newspapers. It's been talked about at various events because it's put it front and center, and that in itself brings value because again it highlights and spotlights this pledge, this promise that exists between those that serve and society and the government. So I think it's highlighted initially and over time then delivering.
Thank you.
Hey. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks for delaying your regular meeting to be with us here this afternoon. It's much appreciated. So it's the same question as all of you. It's about each of your respective devolved administrations. The new covenant, as laid out in this bill, when it becomes law, will lay, it's expanded in scope and there are extra duties there. How ready are your devolved administrations to cope with that extra scope that will come into force with this new bill?
I'll come to you first, James.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, there's a huge obstacle between where we sit now and the implementation of the bill as an act in terms of the Senate elections, and so I think there is, with the current administration and with officials who will provide that continuity, there is an awareness and understanding and planning for the widening of due regard and the fact that Welsh Government itself will become subject to the bill or the act. But obviously we have that great hiatus of the election in between, and then setting up a new government, a new administration, and to see whether they will, have a veterans lead and an armed forces portfolio, and how they will take that forward. But I have engaged with the current administration, and I had latest meeting this week with officials who sit in the Armed Forces branch, who are working closely with Whitehall, the Office of Veterans Affairs and the MOD in terms of what the bill will mean for Wales. But again, we wait and see what the government will look like and how it will take that forward.
I mean, irrespective of the government, you think it's civil service level in Wales, you're confident?
In Welsh Government itself, yes. And then, of course, for the local authorities, we're fortunate we have the Armed Forces Covenant Liaison officers that sit in clusters with local authorities that are charged to deliver the covenant understanding and training. And so they've been working hard at the local level to ensure that awareness is there. And my engagement with the Armed Forces branch of Welsh Government and the officials there, I'm confident they can take it forward.
Thank you.
David.
Yes, so surprisingly, I think the Devolved Assembly of Stormont is in a really good place to provide delivery and to also deliver on the extension. Part of that is circumstances in that the ministers who hold the most relevant departments to the armed forces and veterans happen to be unionist, and therefore are very keen to see the extension and the Armed Forces Covenant delivered. And I can point tangibly to the committee that just last Thursday we had 120 veterans in the room, and Minister Gordon Lyons of the Department for Communities was the guest speaker. And at that, he announced a special telephone text service for armed forces and the veteran community to contact his department around areas of employment, health and benefits. So that's a very tangible, a very welcome, a very positive development. Of course, there still is those within the community of Northern Ireland who have a challenge with the armed forces, given the conflict, and who would not want to see the Armed Forces Covenant extended. However, I do think with the passage of time, there is the realisation that to demand and continue to want a section of community in Northern Ireland to not be treated equally, to be disadvantaged just because they wear a uniform, is not a defendable position to be in 2026. And I often say when I do meet nationalists and we have this conversation, it is unacceptable in 2026. Any political party has a policy that wants to disadvantage any member of our society, but particularly members of the armed forces community. So I'm pleased to say that I'm very heartened, and I think Stormont will move forward at pace where it can to deliver the extension. And certainly of our 11 councils, 6 of those have adopted the covenant as well. So hopefully we will move forward positively within our society.
Susie.
As commissioners, we've had an update meeting with the MOD Covenant team, and it was pleasing to hear that they've been engaging with officials in the Scottish Government in departments outside the Veterans Unit, so some of the affected departments. So some of that work is happening. Again, we'll have an election, so we will have some disruption in terms of government. When it comes to other bodies, particularly local authorities and bodies such as Social Security Scotland, because the guidance hasn't been issued yet, I'm not sure how high the awareness is at the moment. And I think considering that this duty will start in 2027 and will, people needing to plan budgets for the 2027-28 budgets, I'm not wholly convinced that activity is happening at the moment. So I think it's probably a real necessity to get lots of engagement and to get the guidance out as quickly as possible to make sure that can happen in a timely way.
Really helpful, thank you.
Okay, Minister.
I'd like to thank you all very much for your support for veterans all over the country. Really appreciate all of your hard work, and I've spoken to the sort of representative ministers within your devolved administration. I suppose it's focused to you, David. Do you foresee sort of difficulties applying the covenant duty in Northern Ireland, given the political and the security context? I think it'd be useful for the panel just to understand some of the nuances that you're obviously dealing with in Northern Ireland.
David.
Thanks, Minister. So yes, there will continue to be challenges without a shadow of a doubt. And I think one of the biggest challenges is around veterans themselves wanting to acknowledge and highlight the fact that they're veterans. So if they go and visit their GP, particularly around there of mental health, but in some cases physical health issues, and immediately the questions start about your background, there still would be veterans who absolutely are not comfortable disclosing the fact that they've been veterans, and therefore the diagnosis and the treatment is not going to be adequate. And that is a challenge, and it's a difficult one to get over. It's only, I suppose, the passage of time will help that. But that is one tangible example. Politically, then, there still is clearly a divided society. There's a different view on the Troubles, and very often the armed forces are used as a political football, where if one side's seen to be winning, the other side doesn't like that, and therefore you end up with a little bit of a tit for tat. And too often the armed forces community is caught up in the middle of that. So it is real, it is tangible. And of course, I suppose, Minister, as you'll be aware from our various conversations with the commissioners and in your visits to Northern Ireland, having discussed with veterans, the current Troubles Bill is continuing to put a spotlight on those complications. And certainly the bill, as it is currently, we hope that there may be some positive amendments down the line the Prime Minister alluded to. But currently, veterans, certainly in Northern Ireland, would have huge concern about the trajectory of the bill, and that affects all services. The people who their mental health is being affected by the thought of what might be coming down the line with the bill. So the problems exist, but we have to try and find solutions. We have to try and be positive and see how we move forward.
And could I just follow up? Do you think there should be an English Veterans Commissioner?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. And I think my colleagues share that. And it is, in some ways, surprising that if you put all the veterans, say, from Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales together, we probably don't come near what the veterans are in the rest of in England. So from a representative point of view, while a lot of the issues are the same, I certainly be strongly of the view that each country should have its own commissioner to be able to articulate the individual needs of, if you like, those in their own country. And I think collectively that would be able to represent the government in a much more complete and holistic way.
Susie, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, certainly I think it's bizarre that there isn't an English commissioner when I suppose that's 85% of the veteran population, and then the other 15% have 3 commissioners to represent them. Yeah, so I would certainly support that.
And James, do you have anything to add?
Muted, I think. There.
We can hear you.
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, I think that the advent of the Armed Forces Commissioner it makes that gap even more pronounced. You know, for us to be able to engage with the Armed Forces Commissioner as 3, but not represent or have anyone to represent the English cohort. And we quite often do, you know, we've written on various issues as 3, but it seems strange to be addressing collective issues that affect veterans across the United Kingdom and speaking only as the 3 commissioners from the devolved nations. It is a gap that we feel.
Okay. Paul, you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks. And just answered a query I was going to ask there about where's the English commissioner, and maybe it's something that the bill might want to look at. Can I go back to David, if I may, and something rather delicate that the Minister just raised then as well about the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill. And we mention always, don't we, that the whole purpose of the covenant is to prevent disadvantage to a veteran. And don't we run the risk here that there's going to be conflicting legislation, because veterans in Northern Ireland are going to state that they're being disadvantaged potentially by the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill through the courts. And, you know, is this, you know, and this is a real challenge for us, isn't it?
Who'd like to go first? David?
Yes, okay. Look, absolutely, I agree with that line of thought. It is a challenge, and again, it's one that obviously takes up a lot of my time, but indeed it takes up time for my fellow commissioners, because the whole Troubles Bill affects not just veterans who live in Northern Ireland, but of course many who came from the rest of GB, nearly 300,000 to serve in Northern Ireland. So there definitely is a feeling among some veterans that there is a disadvantage in the Troubles Bill, and yet the Armed Forces Covenant is designed to ensure that there is no disadvantage, and you know, particularly, and I suppose poignantly, when you consider how again terrorists have been treated in the past, and that was the past, and there were special circumstances, but still veterans do feel very strongly that they're not been treated fairly, that they've been treated disadvantaged, and that they are going to be exposed to what they would deem to be endless years of lawfare at an incredible cost to the taxpayer, but also to society, as we simply pick over the scab of the Troubles, and veterans are not allowed in their old age to move on into retirement. They're constantly living out the past because they've been forced to, given where we are with the bill and the discussions around it. So I think many veterans would love to be able to enjoy their old age having served without the fear, the apprehension and the uncertainty that the current Troubles Bill is bringing.
Any, James or Susie, have anything to add? Yeah, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I certainly hear from veterans that, you know, there's a focus on the strategic reserve. There's a linkage to those who have served and asking them perhaps to step forward again on one bill that's going through Parliament, and then with the Northern Ireland and Troubles legacy bill, veterans perceive that they're being thrown under a bus, and there is there's great variance there between those two policies, and the requirement to draw on the loyalties and service of veterans on one hand, and yet discount it on the other.
Susie?
Yes, and I think the covenant really focuses on fairness. It's not about special treatment, it's about fair treatment. And there's a risk that the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, as it currently is not bringing in fair treatment for veterans.
Okay. Right, I think that concludes our questions. I've just got one last question. What's the backdrop to your screen, Susie? We're all Sassenachs here, we don't know.
It's the Bass Rock, because I'm speaking from lovely East Lothian.
Okay, well, it's a very beautiful bit of scenery. To say that. Thank you all for coming to give evidence this afternoon. We've really appreciated it. Thank you. Order, order.